There was a time when a new console meant an entirely new graphical experience. The leaps from NES to Super NES and Super NES to Nintendo 64 or PlayStation were gargantuan. In fact, it is really difficult to describe what it was like to be a gamer in those days unless you actually lived through them. Today we live in a different, much more technologically advanced world. Nothing makes this more apparent than the lack of excitement over the next generation of PlayStation and Xbox consoles. Sure, there are some people that are extremely excited, and there are some games that are legitimately amazing looking, but most of what Sony showed looked like it could run on current generation hardware. Some of the games they showed don't look as good as some current PS4 or Xbox One X games. The truth is that there is a lot more going on behind the scenes that will make the next great leap in games possible, but it won't necessarily be the graphical leap people are hoping for. I started really playing games in the NES days, but the Super NES was already on the horizon. The benefits of upgrading to the new hardware were immediately apparent. Super Mario World looked like a truly next-generation iteration of the original, and no one needed a side-by-side comparison to judge the difference. The same was true 5 years later when the Nintendo 64 and original PlayStation launched. Now, we were playing in 3D environments, and technological advancements were measured between games on a platform, not even the platforms themselves. Compare Mario 64 to Zelda Ocarina of Time, or Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy IX. There were huge leaps in what was possible within that generation in a span of just a few years. Moving to the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and even the Dreamcast era, the rise in average resolution did wonders, but so did the available polygon counts. Now we had much closer to photorealistic presentations from our games. At least that's what we thought at the time. With the eventual release of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, the rapid increase in graphical fidelity started to slow down. You could tell that there was a big difference between the previous generation, but the leap certainly wasn't as pronounced as in the past. Moving forward to the current generation, diminishing returns really started to play a factor. I specifically remember being pretty wowed by Killzone on the PS4, but at the same time, Titanfall on the Xbox One and Xbox 360 looked remarkably similar. Of course, over the generation games have looked much better, and the mid-generation hardware refreshes ensured that the consoles were at least attempting to keep up with PC hardware. However, with the new consoles releasing later this year, it is more apparent than ever that diminishing returns are here in full force. Besides Nintendo being the main beneficiary of this later on down the road, what does it mean for the next generation? How are non-hardcore gamers going to be convinced to buy new hardware when it is hard to tell the difference between what they have now and what is coming? Well, the problem exists on many fronts for both Microsoft and Sony. Unfortunately, live streaming events still leaves a lot to be desired. The fact that Sony's PS5 livestream was 1080p and 30 frames per second, with all kinds of artifacting, really did a disservice to the games that they were showing. Even if you watch them later, the average person seeing these may be watching on their phone, tablet, or smaller computer screen and not in full screen. At those sizes, it is incredibly hard to tell the difference between what we have been used to playing and what we'll be playing in the future. To make matters worse, you have games like Red Dead Redemption 2 on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X that look damn near photorealistic already. Even Last of Us 2 coming out right now looks like a game that could be on PS5. The average gamer, unfortunately, isn't going to be able to tell the difference. So how do Microsoft and Sony sell the next generation? Right now they are focused on the SSD component, but that is hard to show someone. You have to experience it. It is like the original 3D feature on the Nintendo 3DS. No matter what Nintendo did to describe it in marketing, you had to see it and experience it for yourself. People are so used to quick cuts in videos that showing a video of a game loading quickly isn't really going to cut it. The new Ratchet and Clank video showed off how the SSD could help do amazing things. Sony needs more of that. The other major upgrade is in CPU power. Back when the PS4 and Xbox One were released, their CPUs were already middling even by the standards of that time. We are getting major upgrades here in both systems. So what does that mean for games? Well, it is ultimately up to the developers to take advantage of the new floor in CPU performance. I imagine that in-game artificial intelligence hasn't moved forward in the last decade and a half mainly because console CPUs were holding everyone else back. Developers needed to program their games to account for the lowest common denominator, and for a long time that has been consoles. We are now at a point where the biggest difference between this generation and the next may just be things like enemy behavior. Enemies that don't give up looking for you after 30 seconds following a headshot to their friend that was just standing right next to them. I'm talking NPCs that think logically and do logical things. I hope that endless streams of enemies running into your line of fire becomes a thing of the past, like a tactics game but in real time, where they work together, communicate amongst themselves to try to distract you and possibly even flank you. Maybe boss battles that are different depending on your playstyle. Rather than you figuring out an enemy's weak point or pattern, the enemy changes what it is doing to combat your weapons and strategy. This doesn't have to be limited to just enemy NPCs either. It could include an extension of what Bethesda was going for in Skyrim nearly a decade ago. NPCs that live their lives, go to work, go to the bar, etc. However, this goes to an entirely new level, and things like this would add an incredible amount of realism and immersion to a game. NPCs that are companions could do a much better job of staying out of the way or simply following your commands correctly. There are so many things that a more powerful CPU can provide, and it is something that, through gameplay, Sony and Microsoft can show people. So that's likely what I would be focusing on in the coming months, combining the SSD and CPU upgrades and showing what that translates to from a gameplay perspective. I'd like to, in a few years, go back to older games, and while they may not look all that much worse, the enemy or NPC AI is so far behind the times that it is hard to play those games anymore because, comparatively, they are all so stupid compared to what we have at the current time. If the focus remains solely on graphics and games that are a year or in some cases several years away from release, I think Sony and Microsoft are going to have a hard time convincing people to upgrade within the next year. Certainly, here in the US, where tens of millions of people recently lost their jobs, it is a hard sell to ask them to shell out $600 plus the cost of games and maybe even 4K TVs that most people still don't own for slightly better graphics. Many people just upgraded to a PS4 Pro or Xbox One X in the last year or two as well, making those purchases seem relatively recent, and compared to those graphical experiences, the difference is even less pronounced. Unlike last generation, where we went a good 7 years without an appreciable hardware upgrade, we had mid-generation refreshes in this generation. It is definitely a hard problem to solve, and I don't envy Microsoft or Sony. However, at the end of the day, it still all boils down to games and price. Who has the best games and provides the best value? That is the biggest question mark we have right now. We don't know how much these systems are going to cost, and we don't know the game lineup that they are bringing to the table. Microsoft has Halo, but that's not as sure of a thing as it was back in the Bungie days. Microsoft is also releasing their games on PC now, so a rather sizable chunk of gamers will just get it there rather than spend hundreds of dollars, especially if their PC can run the game comparably. Sony is in a bit of a different situation though. We don't have any idea what their big games for launch are. At this point, I'd have a Last of Us Part 2 port with all kinds of graphical upgrades ready at launch. I think we may get this, but it won't be announced until sometime maybe in August so as not to cannibalize on the PS4 version sales. Otherwise, Sony may be relying solely on third-party releases, like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Deathloop by Arcane and Bethesda. The launch lineup is pretty sparse, looking at lists online. It is maybe 15 games total so far within the launch window, which is typically 2 to 3 months, so the actual release list on day 1 may be less. Xbox Series X will likely have a stronger lineup with a few more exclusives it seems, and Halo Infinite of course, but Halo Infinite is also coming to the Xbox One, so the burden will be on Microsoft to show gamers how much better the experience will be on the new hardware. So moving forward, it is going to be incredibly difficult to show people the difference in graphics. Microsoft and Sony need to potentially focus on other things. It is anecdotal, of course, but most of the people I have talked to in real life either didn't know there were new systems coming, or if they did, said that they had no intention of upgrading, at least right now. In the end, next generation adoption may take longer than it ever has before, so developers will need to be prepared to develop games for essentially 6 consoles and PCs, and for some games you can also throw the Switch in there. Overall, it is still an exciting time to be a gamer, especially one with their eye toward the future. Let's just hope Sony and Microsoft continue to show compelling reasons why we should be excited. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, maybe click that bell icon, and as always, thank you so much for watching.